Hi everyone. So welcome to the final panel of this year's Review of Small Literatures. I hope this will be a fitting closing devoted to the anthology's return to the Balkan states and the literary voices that are now united in the anthology. I think that it would be suitable to start first with the readings of the poets, so you just get the grasp of the way both of them write. But first I will introduce them. So today here with us here in Buksa is Nóra Ugron. So biography, Nóra Ugron uses she/they pronouns. They are a poet, queer, feminist, anarchist, and anti-speciesist activist, and a member of several radical left collectives in Romania and transnationally. They are a member of the queer feminist literary circle Cenacul X. She's the network coordinator at Eastern European Left Media Outlet and contributing editor at Left East. She has been involved in radical housing justice organizing in the social housing now movement in Cluj-Napoca. Their debut poetry collection in Romanian, Orlando Postuma, was published at Fractalia in 2022. Orlando Postuma was shortlisted for 2 debut poetry prizes and has recently been published as an audiobook at Maga Books. 2 poems from the book were also made into music by fluid queer music duo. Nóra is a doctoral researcher in gender studies at the University of Turku, Finland. And via Zoom, Selma Asotić is joining us. So Selma is a bilingual poet from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we can start with the readings. Which one of you wants to go first? We can start with Nóra, if that's fine with Selma.
First, I just wanted to thank you for inviting me. This was a very lovely festival. I enjoyed it very much until now. Hopefully I will enjoy the panel as well. I'm a bit nervous, but not too much, so let's see. Oare ce mai face Ziggy? Sper că nu e supărată că nu am mai venit. Nimeni nu ne învață cum să explicăm pisicilor despărțirea. Monumentele celor 7 zile ale nedespărțirii. And here just a short explanation. I read 2 excerpts from this 7-part poem. 4. Ridic un monument pentru toate pădurile nepătrunse, mână în mână, pentru momentul când mi-ai zis că îți vine să te duci într-o pădure cu mine și doar să stai, să stăm acolo unde am fost odată, ca niciodată din nou. Ar fi trebuit să devenim copaci și doar să stăm. Să dăinuie părul nostru împletit în vânt, până ce schimbăm nutrienți sub pământ, drag lent și avânt, frânt, 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 frânt. 6. Ridic un monument pentru Marea Neagră care nu va mai atinge picioarele noastre în același timp. Pentru toate lacurile nevuslite vara în București, lacurile neîntrerupte de noi, lacurile la care nu mai avem acces, rămânem reflecții superficiale pe adâncimea închisă. Și doliul este o apă. Where is this? Răsturnarea. Pleurotus auriu, pleurotus roz, Sakura oyster, king oyster, black pearl, king oyster, king blue oyster, pleurotus alb, pleurotus brun, pleurotus, princess pearl, phoenix oyster, pleurotus de vară. 12 tipuri diferite de pleurotus se vând pe un site pentru crescut ciuperci acasă. Există o lume paralelă, altă dimensiune, de vis după moarte, în oglindă, unde creștem toate tipurile de pleurotus, le creștem împreună, stăm în grădini. The ending is missing, but you can read it from there.
So we can, Selma can read her poems now.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So the connection is a little iffy, so hopefully this will work. What language am I reading in? I forgot to ask you that.
Whichever you want, actually.
The original.
Original language.
Okay. So me, in my case, that's a little tricky because some of these poems are written originally in English and some of them were written originally in what we now call Bosnian Christian Serbian Montenegrin, but I will just read them in that language and not the English one. So I'll read 3 poems and I think that will be about 5 minutes. Prvi put u jedinom lezbijskom baru u mom gradu. Crna rupa u zidu. Večeras nosim svoj najbolji očaj i kožu, punu kostiju što su ih 3 džina tresnula u ruševine. Poput svjetlosti, došla sam da ostanem. Iza vrata WC-a djevojke uzdižu se kao aleluja. Rekla sam, želim to što želim, baziliko znoja. Ovdje sreznajuća usta mogu ispjevati tijelu u budućnost. Ja samo čekam da me neko dodirne baš tamo gdje želim nestati i kad bi ruka potražila na krsta, pronašla bih sve već oprošteno. Ne reci želja. Tražim dlane koje mogu sagorjeti i znam da već vidio si sunca, ali nikada jedno ovako bespoštedno, moj svode ugljenisanih uzdaha. Uzmi me ovakvu kakva jesam, prerijsku i još cijelu, neustrašivo, drhteći pomalo. Niko ne piše kući. Piši kad stigneš, preskoči pozdrave. Imamo vremena samo još za ono nepodnošljivo. Umjesto nadam se da si dobro, reci izgubljeni smo. Umjesto navikla sam se ovdje, pusti me da kažem, na ovom kontinentu gradovi su orkestri čekićavom ritma. Na sjevernom polu dave se bijeli medvjedi, a neke nedjelje pronađu način da lažu na snježnu. U njihovom rasipničkom sjaju na jednom smo hrabri, pitamo u prolazu, kad dođe po nas veliki i krajnji muk, hoće li biti paučinas na početku, potom obsidijanski. Piši kad stigneš, preskoči izvještaj o vremenu. Baš u ovom trenutku neko negdje liježe neutješan, a mi samo čekamo na svoj red. Kako smo bešćutni bili, govoreći kao da je govoriti isto što je zjedati u toplini jednog kasnog popodneva, dok prašina na komodi još drhti od smijeha sinoćnjeg gostiju. Čemu sa naša tačkom završena pitanja? Umjesto utjeha, reći ću vatra. Umjesto oprosti, reći ću vatra. Umjesto oktober, reći ću svjetlost poprima boju metka. Osvrni se oko sebe, malo, vidi, zrak je prepun te svjetlosti. I treća i zadnja pjesma za ovaj uvod, ako je samo uspijem naći. Pjesma se zove Matrilinearnost. Jednu rastuče na konce, druga isplete mrežu, treća zahvati. Jedna na koži zareže godine, druga savije rešetke, treća istupi. Jedna pod jezik ušuška trnu, druga uzgoji grlo, treća se usudi. Jedna ogrize kamen ustima, druga proguta zube, treća kljune, progovori.
First, just a little disclaimer. This is my first time moderating, so excuse my awkwardness. I will try my best to fight it and paper beating, but I'm trying my best. So now that you heard the way that these authors write, I think you realize they have pretty different approaches to writing, but instead of focusing on their differences, I think it's way more productive to actually focus on the common threads that tie them together. So despite arising from different contexts, their poetic strategies and approaches share this very intimate but rebellious drive to reflect on desire and loss, while also intertwining both personal and collective experiences. And which I find the most interesting is their sharp sensitivity for the gaps in the poems. So they often use these empty spaces where things are missing, or maybe they are left unsaid or unresolved. And from examining power structures and exposing societal absurdities to expressing hope and defying silence, both of them use their craft as a means to push back against the status quo. And in that way, they are transforming poetry into a space of cunning play, confrontation, and ultimately resistance. So, talking about resistance, I think it's suitable to open the conversation about the concept of queer. When I was thinking about it, the first thing that kind of popped into my mind are other labels, such as women writing, the voice of a generation, feminist writing, and such. And what kind of brings them together is the fact that they are all given to authors who are basically anyone but cis, white, straight, middle-aged men. And what's interesting, it's also something that has to do with autofiction or poetry, which is always considered to be something deeply personal, intimate, and authentic. I have a problem with authentic as well, because it's often put on work done by identities which are marginalized. And therefore I'm interested in how the two of you see your work in this context of queer literature. What does it mean to you? Do you see this as some kind of surface level definition that undermines your work? Do you feel that your work is ever reduced just to its queerness rather than appreciated for its broader literary merits? And how do you even navigate this tension? Whoever wants to start first.
I can maybe start. Yeah, very good question. I think there are some contexts when what I write is reduced to that, and it's very interestingly what came to my mind is actually not necessarily the conservative backdrop against which I am writing, because of course the mainstream literary scene of Romania is quite conservative and patriarchal. But I feel that sometimes in that scene it's even unobserved. So it's like, because it's something that is not translatable to their language, it's not reduced to something, it's just goes parallel with it sometimes. But then there are sometimes these tensions among like LGBT and queer communities when there are some writers who are also queer or identify as some kind of queer person, and they say that the queer is something that I distance myself because queerness is woke, or like queerness is too political. I don't want to identify with that part of queerness. And this is very interesting because when I think about queer literature, it's exactly that queer literature that some people distance themselves from. Because for me, in this sense, queerness goes beyond identity. It's of course identity is an important aspect of it, and it can be an umbrella term, it can also be a sexual or gender identity, and I also identify with that. But for me, queer literature goes against normativity and goes against binaries. We already heard people here talk about this, by the way. So it's very interesting that it's not just my opinion, it's something that pops up in different countries in the Balkan, which I think is important to see, and this festival gave this context to see that how we each think of queer literature. So in this sense, binaries like male, female, hetero, homo, nature, culture, human, animal are all like deconstructed or destabilized. But there's also another part of queerness which I think goes against the authenticity that you mentioned, and I also agree what you said about authenticity, is that I think queerness has an inherent ambiguity in it, which sometimes maybe we try to opt out or like to clear out, but I don't think we should clear out, because I think that's the magic of it, that it's ambiguous and it's undefinable. We try to define it, and we need to define it in a way for each other to understand what we are talking about, but there's at the core always something remaining there that's ambiguous, and I think that's also queerness, and that is a power in literature with which you can play with, because it goes against the status quo and categorization.
Thank you. I think you described it really nicely, and I agree with everything what you said. It's really nice to hear. I'm excited to hear Selma's perspective, since in the books I interviewed, she mentioned that she doesn't resonate with being part of the her word being queer.
That's true. It's never a label that I sort of identified with in terms of my identity. I've always used the word lesbian, which to me is like a very well, it's still, I think, a very unpopular word, and I felt the need to sort of, and I'm sorry for the beeping, I have no idea what that is. It could be a fire, so if I just start, going up in flames, you'll know what's happening. But yes, so I would say that a thing that we should maybe keep in mind is that when we talk about queerness or queer identities, that they don't have to be automatically or inherently subversive. You can have queerness that's also part of, the dominant ideology that's been completely co-opted or subsumed into the dominant ideology, and is also a weapon of the empire and not the weapon of the oppressed. And I think it's a question for us how to navigate that, and how to maybe reclaim that, or how to fight against that, and how to prevent our own identities being weaponized in that way. And I keep thinking about that horrific image that I saw last October, almost a year ago, of a soldier from the Israeli Offensive Forces standing amidst the rubble of Gaza with an LGBT with a pride flag proudly unfurled. So that's, I think, the sort of background against which we're writing and operating. And so I think when I think of poetry, what I sort of try to do is we have these blanket terms like queer poetry or women's poetry, et cetera, and I don't necessarily shy away from them as much as I sort of think that we maybe need to be more self-critical, or also be acutely aware of all of the ways in which our acts of resistance, or when we mean really well, can actually be co-opted and turned against us, and how our acts of resistance very often end up, serving as a kind of fig leaf for the system to cover up its sort of inherent oppressiveness, while projecting an image of plurality where there really isn't much plurality at all. I don't know if I answered it, and I don't know if you could hear me from the constant beeping, but yes. The fire still hasn't reached me, so that's good.
Thank you very much. To kind of deepen the question, so the key goal of this anthology is to dismantle stereotypes, and in both of your writing, one sees recurring themes of resistance and defiance, as I already mentioned. And although there is a long tradition of writing about all these topics, it seems that in recent years it has become especially popular to write about painful, deeply rooted personal and collective traumas through burning social issues and one's own intimacy. And while every heartfelt attempt to address the context of this systemic, structural gender inequality is welcome, I think that reducing a complex exploitative relationship and mechanism with a historical dimension to a quick catalog of stereotypes and is does more disservice to poetry as well as disservice to feminism. And what I especially appreciated, enjoyed in your poems is that you offered much more than just themes, motives, and attitudes. You have developed an exceptional sensitivity and skill for nearly every element of the specifically poetic treatment of language and the organization of text, both on the level of whole poems and lines. So you both are aware that themes you speak about and the medium through which you speak from. So how do you view that pamphlet-like feminism in literature, and how important do you find the form of poem itself in this context?
Yeah, you speak so beautifully about what I write. I feel so flattered. Thank you so much.
Written on paper.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't write poetry if I wouldn't believe in the power of the word to change. And in this, I often lean on this idea from Octavia E. Butler, who wrote in her science fiction novel, The Parable of the Sower, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And I always keep this in mind when I write, because everything I write, it changes something, and everything I write changes me. Even though it's not like changing the world, because that's idealistic and essentializing and simplifying the issue in itself. But it's true that everything that is put on paper, it's put out into the world, and it creates emotions, it creates thoughts in other people, and that's a form of change, or a form of, like, at least a seed of something. Yeah, I often work actually with topics related to love and grief, and also to liberation. And I find that it's very important to kind of write with love about what we write. I'm not saying, like, I write about a lot of, like, oppressive systems. I'm not writing with love about the system, but I'm writing with love and care about the elements, the people, the objects, the animals, the trees, or everything that appears in a poem. And I think a few days ago, Vesna Liponik said that when a tree appears in her poems, it's not there to be a metaphor, it's there to be a tree. And that is also what I try to do. When something appears in my poem, it's not there to be a metaphor for my feelings, it's there to have its own role, in its own being. And I think this is important regarding feminism and regarding I don't know if you want to achieve justice at some point in the world, because literature helps you think about words that don't exist yet, or it's always, of course, a trap, because maybe you cannot conceive of something entirely new, but you can think of things that are not like that in the real world. And in this sense, I like Ursula K. Le Guin's ideas about there's this famous quote: "We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings." And for me, this is a quote that reminds me of the force of thinking and the force of imagination that is capable of coming up with organizations of the world that are different than the one that we live in, even if it seems that it's co-opting everything. And I totally agree with Selma that we need to be very, very careful and very on point not to fall into the traps that capitalism and colonialism gives us with homo-nationalism and pinkwashing, and how they use they use our identities to do some sort of elite capture, which means that they gain resources and just use our being. Yeah, I don't know if I answered, but
yes, you did beautifully. I'm glad you mentioned the what Vesna said, because I think it resonates with your poetry as well.
Mm-hmm. I also very much enjoyed Nora's answer, and I agree on a lot of those points. Especially, I think, you mentioned this like pamphlet-like writing, and I never really understood it. I mean, if you want to write poetry, how can you not be interested in that particular form and what it does and the way that it communicates? I mean, if you want to write a pamphlet, go write a pamphlet. Why are you turning it into a poem? It doesn't make particular sense to me that you would be so uninterested in the way that language operates in a poem. I mean, that's what we as poets do. And I think I've been thinking a lot about this. What is the role of poetry and maybe somebody could sample this into a techno feed. I have this favorite quote that a dear teacher of mine, the poet Nicole Seeley, it's a slogan that's very often applied to journalism, but she sort of applied it to poetry when they asked her, what is the purpose of poetry? She said, the purpose of poetry is to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. And I always sort of hang on to that, because we do live in quite despairing times. And I think despair is always the tool of the powerful. And I was rereading an old interview that I read with the late, great Mike Davis recently, in which he was asked about hope. And he said, hope is not a scientific category, and it's not a requirement for polemical writing, and I don't really care if you have hope or if you're hopeless, but you need to fight. I'm butchering the very inspirational thing that he said, but I kind of feel the same about poetry. I don't think that poetry can be whatever it wants to be. I don't think it owes us hope as an element. I think poetry is perfectly fine being hopeless if it wants to be hopeless, but I think that there's something in our act of this, and you asked me about this, you put it in your written questions, this thing that I said, that for me, poetry is kind of radical doubt and radical faith at the same time, and that goes back to what Nóra was saying, that it's this act of faith, it's this act of communication, that you're reaching out to someone across all possible divides in the hope that you will be able to communicate with them. And I think that when we write about the world and sing about the world, even when it's ravaged and mutilated, it's a way of fighting for it.
Thank you so much. Now I would just shortly like to discuss more. I mean, both of you kind of mentioned it, but I want you to elaborate because I find it interesting. So, like the idea of the personal is political, which has long been central to the feminist and queer thought. So I'm interested in how both of you navigate this in your work, and do you find that revealing your personal experiences automatically becomes a political act, especially considering that it kind of challenges norms about gender, sexuality, or identity?
It's a curse to be in the room, because then you are kind of like forced to go first all the time. And
oh, I can go first. I don't mean this to be an unequal exchange. And there's no beeping, so
if you don't mind, you can go first now.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I have a very short answer for this, that my answer is no. I don't think that voicing personal experiences automatically makes them political, and it doesn't have to be a political act. I think the personal needs to be elevated to the sphere of the political, and that's our task, that's our job, to transform the personal into the political. Otherwise, I think we just end up in a kind of narcissistic, self-congratulatory, self-interested navel-gazing. So for me, and I'm not interested in myself. I mean, I try not to be. I try not to be that involved with myself, and I think I try to use my personal experience, the particularities of my personal experience, as a kind of basis that can be transformed into something more, something greater than that, into something more universal, and also into something that can participate in a collective struggle. So that would be my short answer, that the personal needs to be transformed into the political, otherwise we risk reducing the political to the personal, which is, I think, a disaster for any movement or for any progressive politics.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you for this answer. And I think it's exactly where the capitalist system can co-opt our struggles with individualizing our stories instead of making it about the collective. And I try to keep it in mind, this autoethnographic approach to the personal is political, which says kind of that a good autoethnography reveals a personal story that is meaningful in a collective context. So you reveal a personal story, but it's something that through that you understand something about the world. And that understanding is relevant for you, and that is political for me in the personal.
And how does, considering all of this, how does your activism influence your poetry? In what ways, or in what ways does it influence your creative process? And how does queerness open up spaces beyond the traditional binaries that you mentioned, and human-centered perspectives as well?
Yes, thank you. I think there are two sides of this coin. There is the what and the how, of what brings activism to my poetry and how. The what are some kind of topical interests that I already mentioned, this idea of Le Guin with thinking beyond our world. And also, then she has another idea about carrier bag theory of fiction, which, to wrap up shortly, she says that our world is the patriarchal, the cis-heteropatriarchal capitalist colonial world is written from the style of a killer story in which there's a big hero who saves the world, and this big hero is a cis-hetero male, white, blah, blah, blah. And there's always a conflict that is not like a productive conflict, but it's a killing conflict. And instead of this, she writes for life stories that are like carrier bags, and that are careful and encapsulate something that is not about competition all the time, or not about who is the bigger hero. And I like to keep this in mind when I write. This is maybe also how and the what in the same time, because I also keep this in mind in my activism, kind of. And there's this another thought of which is connected, another world is possible, and I think that is the driver force of my activism and of my writing at the same time. But I already touched upon that. And then there's also on the how side, that I think the literary scene is organized in a way that is focused on literary prizes and competition and the genius and talent, and I don't believe in these categories. I think what is beneficial actually is mutual aid among other writers, and we really practice that. I'm part of this literary circle you mentioned, Cenaculix. We founded it in 2021. Since then we have 60 members. All of them are young queer authors who felt very alone before in the literary scene, or they were just writing for themselves. And now we kind of share with each other what we write and share our stories, and we give feedback to each other, and it really helps. A lot of people published already from that group individual volumes, or started publishing in magazines, or we organize poetry events when we read for the public, and this is a really big thing in the mainstream scene, where the main focus is on, as I said, competitions and prizes, and also even shaming other people for how they write. And I think that's a very toxic attitude, and it contributes to so many people giving up on writing instead of encouraging other people to write. And this is the how side of my activism that affects my writing, or at least it's a part of activist writing, I could say, in this sense.
Oh, great. Thank you for mentioning the bad sides of the literary scene. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Considering the creative process, someone said that the essence of her poetry, Selma, you said that the essence of her poetry are the concepts of radical doubt and radical faith. So I'm interested in how that influences the way you write.
So yes, radical doubt is a phrase I like because it's something that I try to keep in mind every time I sit down to write, because I think poetry should ideally turn assumptions into questions. And that also means that you need to first figure out what your assumptions are, and what are the things that you take for granted so that you can then turn them into questions. And to approach a poem as this space where you find something out instead of just blurt out what you believe is the truth. And I've already mentioned faith, as in who knew I would be using these religious terms? I'm not a particularly religious person, but yes, this belief that communication is possible. That would be a very sort of simple answer, I think, but for me. And I mean, on another level, I also feel that to write poetry, I don't know, maybe this is an experience that Nóra shares or doesn't, but every time I write a poem, I really feel like I will never do it again. And then somehow I do write it again, and then as soon as I do it, suddenly it seems like it's impossible to do again. So there's something about writing that it seems impossible, and yet here it is, and it's there, and we're doing it, and I don't even know what sustains this endeavor other than this often blind faith that you're moving towards something, towards saying at least one true thing, and if you can do it, then you can die happy. And I also enjoyed listening to Nóra about her activism. I currently live in the United States of America, where my activism has been reduced to insulting Americans. This is my contribution to the world.
Amazing to hear.
I'm very good at it.
Okay, this actually has to do with my next question for Nóra. Combined with desire, amazing combo. It's very interesting, and I've never seen it yet. The way you explore queer love and loss, but it's intertwined with the backdrop of capitalist extraction and ecological collapse. And you also express solidarity with Palestine and critique global injustices. And you use queer desire as a mean of intersectional struggles like colonialism or destruction. And how does desire in your work serve as a form of rebellion?
Thank you for that question. Can I ask some water? I'm really thirsty. We forgot that. Thank you. So my volume Orlando Postuman is about a lost queer love and also about ecological collapse, as you mentioned. And throughout the volume, I explore my own grief towards this lost love, and also my own grief towards the world that I feel that I'm losing and is dying in front of my eyes. And what was my perspective when I wrote it is that it really influenced me how Tom Van Doren and Deborah Rose and Donna Haraway think about grief as not opposed to action, but as a form of learning to deal with loss and work through trauma, and in itself as a form of action. So for me, grief is a very important channel to talk about what is happening in the world, what is happening with us, and something necessary to go forward, in our lives, or to be able to live in this world that is, as Selma also mentioned, very, very dystopic and horrible sometimes. And so I saw that there are these two things. There is my love and there is the world, and they are both suffering from capitalist extraction. And in this sense, I kind of like felt that queer love is obstructed by extraction. So I put my love on a planetary scale, but I also put the planetary scale, intersected it with, like, put love to the planetary scale, not just my love. Okay, maybe this was confusing. I don't know what I wanted to say with this. Let's move on to another topic apart from grief, which is liberation, because you mentioned colonialism and ecological collapse and the fight against that. And I think the perspective which connects my queer love, my queer desire to all these like injustices that we are facing and we are like put through is the what we are struggling for in this, and for me that is liberation, and we could say maybe total liberation, to use this anti-species like category. And also this idea that none of us are free until each of us are free. Yeah, and another thing about love, I think in the patriarchal literary tradition, it's very interesting how love poetry is both like put on a pedestal and both hated. So it's like both big authors are both like adored for their muses and how they write about their dear loves. And when you write love poetry, sometimes it's also thought that it's something inferior to philosophy and to those big topics like war and stuff like that that is discussed in literature. And I tried with my poetry to deconstruct this and to give an importance to love poetry and also a form that is different from writing for muses that are like unattainable and you do whatever you want with that muse. Instead, I tried to write with my feelings, write with the person because I dedicated my volume to someone, to write with this person and also to not expose their experience in a way that is harmful. Because I see love as the basis for kind of like everything in a way in our lives. So I think it's important that we develop and explore ways to explore love and express love in a way that's not exploitative and not extractive, because extraction is already obstructing it. I think that's my answer.
Thank you, amazing. Very, very smart. And considering the desire, I think that Selma, you do this in a completely different way. At least that's how I see it. The topic of desire is always somehow connected with the emptiness. And I'm interested in how do you intertwine and how do you write about desire while using like the concepts of emptiness and distance at the same time, and why?
I wasn't aware that I was doing that. Thank you for letting me know. Now I need to think about it. Yes, I need to go back to my own book and figure it out. But a lot of people have told me this, that like there was one review that called my book like too like dark or too pessimistic, and I thought, no, this is the most optimistic I've ever been. Like, what are you talking about?
I read that review and I was like, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so maybe it's me. It's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. But I just want to. Yes, I had to think about this, and I've been thinking about it while Nóra was talking, and I think. I wrote this book that has a lot of different themes in it, including war, including love, including desire, and including grief. And then a lot of the questions that I feel that when I was promoting the book was, how did you put all of this together, and how does this all make sense? Because they appear such disparate topics of conversation. And now it's occurring to me that actually the entire book can be reduced to these two main emotions, which is desire and grief. And if you think about it, if you think about the word grief in English, I really liked it. It's one of my favorite words in English, and we don't really have a good equivalent in our language, because the interesting thing about grief in English is that it's not just, sadness and mourning, it also has an element of longing to it. And I don't think that we can find an adequate term that would combine both mourning and, well, mourning itself, you could argue, is a form of longing, but there's a kind of desire in grief that makes grief a form of desire itself. So desire and grief are both sort of reaching towards something. They're both aspiring towards something, and they're not, emotions or terms that would seem as opposed as they might initially. So yes, that would be my short answer. And for emptiness, I really don't know. I mean, I felt empty after writing the book, but it didn't feel like that while I was a the actor writing it. I remember I had a teeny-weeny breakdown, and I was emailing people because I was trying to find a therapist, which in the US is impossible. Everybody's like, I can take you in 2 years. And I was writing these very professional emails asking people, are you taking any new clients, et cetera, et cetera. And at one point I stopped writing very professional emails, and I started writing pretty desperate ones. And I remember that in those emails, the word full and fullness just like kept coming up. And I remember writing to one therapist that I was full of grief. And so that's how I felt when I was writing the book. I felt that I was like, that it was overflowing, that there was like an overabundance of all kinds of things, all kinds of emotions, and that I was sort of, trying to get rid of some of that excess by turning it into poems. So it's interesting to hear that from like a reader's perspective, there's emptiness in it. So that's something that's food for thought.
Yeah, I think you explained it excellently, and I would just like to add that I don't think that necessarily this emptiness and desire are opposed to each other or like contrasted. I think they coexist and intertwine really nicely. And this is a bit more of a switch. I would just like to take a chance to be a bit bratty and just rant about how literary scenes are miserable places to exist. So for Nóra, I would like to kind of, considering I really liked your poem, which is translated in Croatian like Ars Prestica, in which you talked about it. You go after the lyrical subject goes after established patriarchal writers, and who suggested that they should write about something other than love, implying that love poetry isn't serious enough. I empathize with it. It made me laugh and activated my anger at the same time. And I think what's really, really important to keep talking about is how hard it is to be a beginner, a young, not yet fully established author at the literary scene, and how the path to visibility and success for young writers is actually a space which is dominated by the retrograde sexist boomers, and is large and is in a way tied to building connections with more estimated and powerful men. And in such cases, you are expected to be very thankful for their recognition. So what do you think, should one in this situation preserve their peace and just let everything go? Or should one contradict these demands, and how?
Okay, very good question. I don't think I have a recipe for everyone. I think everybody finds a way to cope with it in a different way. But what I personally do is that, yes, I have this long story of how I started writing. I started writing in my mother tongue, which is Hungarian. And the literary scene in Transylvania was quite conservative, quite patriarchal, and there were these literary circles where the invited author was criticized, so much that sometimes people left crying. And I criticized that scene, and I was like, there is no point in it. And with my comrades, with my friends, we actively criticized this, and then after, in this big criticizing, I lost my voice in a way. I didn't know how to write. For years I didn't write anything, and I thought that I won't write anymore again, until I found queer feminist authors, queer feminist Romanian authors who speak Romanian, and I learned to write in Romanian poetry just to be in conversation with them. So now I write in Romanian, which is not my mother tongue. And what we do together is kind of, we form our own circles, our own literary scene that is kind of like a bit outside of the mainstream scene, is not inside in a way. Of course you cannot be completely on the outside, it's like with capitalism as well, it's always, you go in and out, it's kind of like a play, a game that you need to learn to navigate. But that's why we have the literary circle, Cenaculix, with the queer authors. There is a literature and feminism, feminist blog that publishes feminist literature. There's Kotra magazine, which is this queer feminist magazine that publishes articles and poetry as well. There is the Fractalia Publishing Housing, which is a socialist, leftist publishing house who publishes queer feminist literature. And in these circles, we kind of like make our world in a way that we want to make our scene. But sometimes, of course, you get invites from other events, and there's always a question of compromise, what you accept and what you don't accept. Like, I go to events sometimes, and then I get invites that I won't accept because I don't want to go on a stage with certain people, or go on a stage at an event that promotes values that are contrary to my values. So in this sense, it's also, sometimes I work against my own visibility, or I create a different kind of visibility for my work that the mainstream would give.
I think, yeah, it's a compromise that every author has to make in a way, but you are somehow forced to make it. You have no, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard. And so you touched on this topic in your poems, and Selma, I was stuck reading your interviews, and I was delighted when I realized that you are a big and loud hater of the regional literary scene, and that's how I interpreted it, at least. You mentioned that you try to engage with it as little as possible, and in general avoid things that disturb your piece in writing. So I'm interested in what angers you the most about it, and do you think there is any hope for the regional scene? And just like the same question goes for you. Do you think it's better to preserve your piece or to contradict it? Sorry.
Thank you for this easy question. I'm wondering what interview you read, but I very much agree. So the reason why I'm doing this and why I've been able to publish this poem is because I was very lucky in that my entry into the literary world really happened through this group of fellow women writers who were the opposite of Nora's experience, super supportive and super kind to me. And had I not had that, I think I would have just disintegrated into a particle of dust. And yes, we have to build our own communities. And I think if there's a possibility to just like turn the laptop so I can say hi to the audience, that would be great, because I do think that I have a couple of friends there. And I'm very happy that they're here. Ciao, Sigma. But yes, that's how it happens. You build your own communities, and I think what angers me, well, there are several things about my particular situation. One is that I participate in two communities at the same time. So I live and work in the US, but I also participate in the literary community in the Balkans. And in the US, I have one problem, is that I am pigeonholed as an Eastern European poet. And that's an identity that I never assumed or even thought I had until I came to the US. And of course, if you move in the poetry circles in the US, there's a very clear expectation of what an Eastern European is supposed to be and what an Eastern European poet is supposed to sound like. And I became very, distraught when I realized that I could build a very fine poetic career by telling my American readers exactly what they want to hear. or what they expect to hear from this perspective. And so a lot of the poems that I wrote are written against this expectation because I wanted to disappoint their expectation of what an Eastern European poet sounds like and what an Eastern European poet writes about and what I'm supposed to be grateful for, living in this country and being a part of it. And then I also participate in the literary scene and the Balkans, and you find your people and you move in these circles, and I'm also a very anti-competition. I'm not a very competitive person. Well, when I played basketball, I was extremely competitive, and then I realized that this beast was in me, and so I stopped playing basketball. But I really do not perceive literature as any kind of competition. I really look at it as a kind of collective endeavor of humanity to sort of make something, and I think it very much is a conversation. It's a conversation that happens collectively. But another thing that I've noticed recently when talking about feminism or what's termed women's literature, even we can maybe put queer literature in that as well, is that, right now there's a situation where there is a kind of market, like the logic of the market is completely, chewed up and then spat us back out. And you can now write books with a feminist theme and be a part of the mainstream. So I don't think these topics are as marginal. I think they've been transformed. I think that publishers have realized that there is a market for it, that there is an audience for it, and that there is money to be made in it. And what my question is now is how to intervene in this particular situation and how to continue writing what I want to write without sort of playing into this trend of turning this into a market nation, turning this into something that's actually like quite profitable. And so that's a question. I had this idea for a series of poems that I wanted to write about femicide and about violence against women. I wanted to write a series of erasure poems, and I've actually shelved that idea because I don't know how to intervene in that conversation in this particular moment without sort of sinking into this larger trend of the market just completely swallowing everything and spitting it back out as a product. So that's something that I'm struggling with right now, and I'm trying to find an angle how to write about it, but to write against this sort of mainstreaming or streamlining of feminist literature that I'm noticing. And there was another point that I wanted to make, but it has completely escaped my mind. So maybe I'll remember.
I just wanted to answer what you said, because I think it's very fascinating. I find that we struggle with quite similar things also, even though you said this about the US context with this Eastern Europeanness that is put up on you. With my literary group, we just edited an anthology about queerness in Eastern Europe and how to be queer in Eastern Europe, because I think on that there is also kind of an expectation. What does it mean to do that? And it comes in the same time from the West, but comes also from the interior of like Eastern European queer context, when there is this respectably politics very active, and it's supposed that you fight for your rights, fight for a right to marry, and like want to achieve some form of like equality similar to liberal context in other places of the world where there is at least legal equality achieved. And this is the way that people should, like, this is the way, the trajectory that queer activism should take in Eastern Europe. And I feel that there is this pressure, and in that anthology we kind of like try to find aspects of queerness in Eastern Europe that is different, and what does it mean to be queer in Eastern Europe, but also aspects of Eastern Europe that is different than this concept of a backward country that is bad, and instead put the blame on neoliberal transformations, not the blame on the country that is backward because it's inherently and essentially like that. So it's interesting how you cannot escape this. Like you're in Eastern Europe or you're outside of Eastern Europe, there is this thing that you need to deal with. And also, I said that the mainstream is conservative in Romania, but there is also mainstream feminism that is like growing, and the market is like going for that. So that also is a problem we need to deal with in Romania as well.
I'm very satisfied with your answers. I think you both actually answered that the only way for it is to contradict these demands in whatever way possible. So I'm interested if there's any questions from the audience, maybe.
Yeah, thank you very much for tonight and the whole festival. I really enjoy your work, and I am looking forward to reading more. Yeah, I really like your report, Nóra. Now that I also heard that part of you, I'm looking forward to hear more. It resonated with me. I wanted to comment especially on the way both of you answered the first question and how you, Nóra, answered the last question. I find it very important and a bit intriguing. And I would like to use this opportunity to kind of maybe deepen the way we talk about these things and how we see the tactics and the strategies of queer, what it means to us, and how do we really deconstruct all of this heteronormative patriarchy. And in order to, I would like to, if I may, just quickly read something. By the way, I tried to support this festival by printing some signs that you can find for free here in the shoebox in the corner, and feel free to pick them up. Also, Nóra, the Ursula quote that she used also on a sticker. Anyway, yeah, sorry, it won't be in English, but I'll try to be real quick. From a sign called Identity, Politics and Anti-Politics, Critical Perspective. Sorry. Is it necessary? Can you hear me?
Camera, if you want to.
I hope it won't be recorded anyway. Anyway, so yeah, sorry, Nóra, but I think you'll know. So here it goes. This design says, stoga nastaje očita kontradikcija između nužnosti prepoznavanja društveno konstruiranog identiteta, dok u isto vrijeme pokušavamo uništiti klasno društvo koje takve identitete nameće. Ova kontradikcija je komplicirana, a reakcija na nju kreće se u rasponu od zanemarivanja uništenja klasnog društva do zanemarivanja identiteta i brojnih drugih argumenta koji se nalaze negdje između ova dva stajališta. Problem je u tome što nema kontradikcije. Za uništenje klasnog društva nužna je analiza načina na koji funkcionira. Kratko, moramo poznati neprijatelja. Međutim, važno je izbjeći znake esencijalizma. Uvijek mora biti jasno kako šire društveno-ekonomske strukture konstruiraju ovi identiteti. Državna moć i moć kapitala nameću presiju koja utječe na ljude raznih identiteta. Razumijevanje ovoga stvara premisu solidarnosti, budući da oni koji su marginalizirani unutar svoje zajednice stvaraju bliskosti s onima koji vode slične bitke. Okay, let's stop here and maybe go back to English and maybe make things more clear anyway. So yeah, here also somewhere it mentions something that hasn't been mentioned these days, and I think it's really important, and this is the institutional violence. So when we back to also reference the way you answered your first questions, which we have heard these days, and which is usually how queer is contextualized and explained, I don't know, like an umbrella term, challenging binaries, heteronormativity, and so on and so on. But as I said, I would like to go deeper and a bit more specific, and to say that simply isn't it about the law in the end? Not only, of course, we are oppressed in so many different ways, or outside the law as well, but the institutional violence is what affects us a lot as well. So to to bring this all together. This has little to do, I'm sorry, with the writing and what this festival is primarily focused on. So not to, I don't want at all to sound like I'm criticizing your work, none of that, not even close, of course. As I said, I love your work. But just to use this opportunity to widen the way we talk about all of this, and to also mention something that I personally think is important, and that is the legal system itself. And again, to connect it to the last answer of the question, I'm not sure, Nóra, if I understood you correctly, but you said, I think you said that for Eastern Europe, we need to go in the direction of making maybe things more secure by finding this security through more rights and the legal system, which is not sure. I've met you a bit, yeah. Just to finish quickly. Whereas, I mean, this is not a popular perspective because it's very touchy, and of course we need to protect people who need documents tomorrow, next week, and so on and so on. But I think a very important question is exactly when to go in this direction, when to use the tactics of protecting people through the law, and when to go beyond or around it in other ways.
I try to be short. I think your conclusion that when to do what, which tactic, is a very important question, but I didn't mean, I was not advocating for a legalist perspective. I was kind of like trying to say that we should think more broadly than the legalist perspective, which is the dominant perspective of LGBT organizations, and it's understandable for many reasons why, because there are people who suffer from the lack of equal laws, and it's for everyone's benefit that in the system that we have same opportunities and we don't have that yet. So it's of course something that I respect, but it's not my fight in a way, because I kind of like try to challenge the legalist perspective by challenging the law itself. The law itself is written in a colonial and cis-heteronormative and racist way. So the law is itself created to exclude. So why, I mean, of course we should include what is possible to include until a certain point, but after a certain point the goal of the fight is not just to change the law, is to change the order of the world. And then the law is a tactic that you use to attain prosperity or like flourishing or like just well-being until you can do more than that. For me, that's the...
Any more questions?
But maybe someone maybe someone can't hear the question.
I did hear part of it, and I heard your response. And well, when I was younger, I found that famous quote by Audre Lorde, "The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house." I found it, very inspiring. And the older I get, the more against that quote I am, because I think we absolutely should use the master's. We should use all tools at our disposal to dismantle the house. We should not sort of close off tools and avenues a priori for ourselves. But I think what you were mentioning, Nóra, is very important, that yes, you can use law and the legal system to improve people's lives in the sort of immediate here and now, but with the awareness that these were never, made to serve you. They were made to serve others, other interests. So yes.
Any more questions? Okay.
So I really like how you point out that not elevating personal to political, but instead reducing political to personal is disastrous. But can you maybe, both of you, elaborate a bit on this? My concrete question would be, is this the process that in a way enables, prevents prevents meaningful conversations, meaningful dialogue on one hand, and on the other hand is a process that enables this cooptation and this essentially commodification of, let's say, identity.
Selma, do you hear the question?
No, I didn't hear that question.
Maybe you could copy.
So I really like how you pointed out that not elevating personal to the level of political, but instead reducing political to personal is disastrous. And I wanted to ask both of you, maybe if you could elaborate a bit on this thought. But at the same time, I wanted to ask a bit more concrete, concise question regarding this same idea, and that's do you think that this process of reducing political to personal is essentially what prevents some meaningful, productive dialogue on one hand, and on the other hand, is this same process that enables cooptation and commodification of identities? Thank you.
I guess everybody's looking at me, so I guess that was for me. Well, did I really say that? That sounds like a smart thing, and I don't really say those. But I do agree with you that it does make it easier to co-opt and to sort of destroy. Like this reduction of the political to the personal does make co-optation and commodification much easier. But the first part of the question was about how to avoid this, or can you just repeat what the first part of the question was?
Well, the first part was, is this the same process that prevents even the possibility of some meaningful exchange, meaningful dialogue, because everybody is like entrenched in their own, positions and can't even try to comprehend anything outside of them?
Yes, and I mean, I think it starts to sort of obscure what our real goals are, and it sort of draws our attention to the particulars and to the minutiae instead of broadening our horizon and sort of broadening the scope at which we view things and at which we analyze things, and then also the level at which we act and react to things. So yes, I would say that the answer to that would be yes.
Thank you.
And I think for a lot of people, part of my comment comes from my frustration with how, if you look at, for example, feminism, of course, it's been completely co-opted, and an especially sort of egregious form of that is when people assume that, it is enough to put the label or to adopt the label of feminism, and that everything you do therefore becomes feminist, that all choices you make therefore become feminist. So this is that inversion that I'm talking about, because you're starting from the personal. It's like me, I'm identifying with this word, therefore everything I do is political because it's feminist and because I'm a feminist. And so it's a kind of inversion that is to me quite nonsensical.
No more questions, or are there any? We're a bit out of time, right? I think thank you everyone for your attention, and I think the fitting way would be for Selma and Nóra to read their poems.
While we wait for the screen, I just want to add that I agree with what Selma said and also with you. And I think what you described is to me this individualization of the struggle and individualization of the world, in which the individual becomes always the focus, and capitalism thrives on that because it's everything about you. It's never about us or the other. Pierdere planetară. 1. Iubire mărunțită în corp ca bucățelele de microplastic, care în ocean sunt de 500 de ori mai multe decât stele pe cer. Curgi în sângele meu, te pompează inima în jur de 90 de ori pe minut. Ai murit în mine cu diferite populații de rechini, cu 80% din rechinii vulpe, cu 86% din rechinul taur, cu 86% din rechinul ciocan, cu 99% din rechinul ciocan crestat. Ultimul 1% bântuie singuratic adâncimile și cu rechinii au dispărut 70% din păsările de mare după 1950. Nu mai ascult muzică de când nu mai ești aici. Fiecare dispariție atrage o altă dispariție. Plasele navelor de pescuit zgâlțuie apa, mâna malefică a morții pentru profit. Tonul roșu este cel mai scump pește pe pământ. O bucată se vinde cu 3 milioane de dolari la piața de pești din Tokyo. Mai puțin de 3% din neamul lor e încă în viață. Sfântă Treime, profitul, moartea și credința. Nu este nimic mai normal decât să vinzi ultimii pești din lume. Mereu va fi altă iubire. Rechinii omoară aproximativ 10 oameni într-un an. Oamenii omoară între 11.000 până la 30.000 de rechini într-o oră. Doar ca așa zis subprodus pescăresc. Milioane de corpuri prinse aleatoriu în plasele profitului. Copiez date din documentarele populare de pe Netflix, ce va rămâne din noi toate, aripi de rechin fierte, milioane de cadavre aruncate înapoi în apă, ridurile de sub ochii tăi vor păli în amintirile mele și se vor adânci pe fața ta curând. Scânteierea ochilor tăi oceanici, lucire, licărire, orbitoare. Fitoplanctonul fluorescenți forfotesc în scădere. Fitoplanctonul produc până la 85% din oxigenul pe care îl respirăm și absorb de 4 ori mai mult dioxid de carbon decât pădurile din Amazon. Fitoplanctonul sunt fertilizați de balene și delfini care ajung morți pe maluri, balene și delfini cu burți pline de plastic. Din plasticul care ajunge în ocean, doar 0,03% sunt paie. În mijlocul Oceanului Pacific este o insulă de plastic. Nature Cultural New Geography of Love in Toxicity. 46% sunt nevoade și restul în majoritate alte unelte de pescuit. În timp ce ne îngrijorăm de paiele noastre, până la 5 milioane de pești sunt omorâți în fiecare minut. Ci că nu există nicio altă industrie care omoară așa multe animale. Ar trebui să mă uit la un alt documentar despre industria animalieră ca să aflu câte găini mor pe minut. Într-un singur KFC se aruncă 10 sau 100 de aripoare, rămase reci la fiecare jumătate de oră, într-o lume în care aproape fiecare oraș are cel puțin un fast food similar și unele au 10. Și orașe avem sute de mii. Matematica morții capitaliste, corelată unei singure povestiri de dragoste, de pierdere planetară. Ai murit în mine cu diferite specii de pești, cu 99% din cambulă, cu 86% din cod, cu 86% din tonul roșu, cu 99% din eglefin. Am mâncat eglefin o singură dată din viața mea în Gibraltar sau parcă era Scoția și habar nu aveam că mănânc un individ din ultimul procent supraviețuitor din familia sa după anii 70. Până 2048 poate vom avea oceane goale. Doar particulele de microplastic vor forfoti ca rănile invizibile ale iubirilor netratate la timp. Oceanele vor fi goale? Ce înseamnă asta? Oceanele sunt așa de mari încât nu ni le putem imagina nici măcar pline. Când te uiți la mine, văd doar schelete albe de corali morți, acolo unde cândva era o panoramă de pești zburdători. Și de oriunde pornim, tot acolo ajungem, înainte, înapoi, apa curge în cercuri și iubirea la fel. 2. Rămân doar bacterii, ultimele supraviețuitoare ale iubirii și ale extragerilor, unduire, plutire, freamăt, în pete verzi albăstrui pe plajă, sub rămășițele discotecilor unde nu ne-am petrecut. În mozaicul moleculelor de microplastic, bacteriile se mai înmulțesc. Cine a murit și cine întreabă? Vor rămâne martori, va fi cine să jelească? Când se sfârșește iubirea? Când se sfârșește lumea? Când peștii se sufocă în năvoade prinse, nu vedem moartea lor. Peștii nu simt. Pescuitul nu e o ucidere. Cine a murit și cine a văzut? Cine a ținut năvodul? Cine a mâncat? Cine a luat profitul? Când pescarul cade de pe punte, soția sa plânge, apoi va fi alt pescar și altă soție. Ciclu biogeopolitic. Cine a murit și cine a adus coroana la o înmormântare? Sau nici măcar? Cine a angajat? Cine cumpără și cine dă salariul? Cine va muri întâi? Ultimul pescar sau ultimul pește? Cine va muri prima? Lumea sau iubirea? Pe care este mai greu să o ții în viață? Pe care este mai greu să o pierzi, să o jelești? Pe care este mai greu să o amintești, să o dorești, să o scrii, să o rescrii, să reinventezi, să reînmulțești? Care va renaște prima?
Selma, you can read yours.
Well, okay. I'll just read 2 poems and I'll leave it at that. Zašto govoriti? Zato što zrak nema težinu, a u sebi nosi sve što postoji. Zato što su stepe prosute sicilijanske naranče i mirišu na barut. Zato što nana na nebu još krpi gunene čarape. Zato što je još čujem kako govori, danas mi je u očima neki mrak. Zato što je svijet punočio. Zato što zavisi na prozoru u kućama koje još stoje. Zato što u Slavoniji, u neoznačenom grobu, leži jedna djevojčica. Zato što je nana prva u svom selu, umjesto otiska prsta na bračnom listu, ostavila svoje ime. Zato što vam još ne znam svima imena. Zato što Čao, Isidora. Zato što je moj grad onaj koji mi je pozvala tetka. Zato što tetka više ne puže. Zato što slast kojom puhuje dim cigarete. Zato što rak u njenoj maternici. Zato što su bogovi veliki samo kad su ljudi. Zato što na granici ispred odljikave žice čovjek drži bocu mlijeka u plastičnoj kesi. Zato što je njegovo lice lice mog oca. Zato što smo krivi, iako nam sve oči rađaju nevini. Zato što ne mogu zaboraviti to što sam vidjela. Brodovi i svjetionike, zastavu rasvrnom grkljenu, nepomučenost kasapina. Zato što pečunica na balkonu. Zato što je nespokoj pravednih. Zato što svjetlost mora prevaliti toliku samoću, samo da bi stigla do nas. Zato što je svijet punočio. Zato što se neke oči više ne mogu zatvoriti. Niko ne piše kući. Nešto se stalno slama na nebo iznad nas. Pokušavam se sjetiti svitaca u tvojim sklopljenim rukama. Kasni avgust. Na našoj koži ljeto nije znalo kako odustati. Okliznula sam se trčeći za trobom, već zamaklom sa druge strane brda, gdje mrtva usta vojnika makovima šapuću tajne korijenje. Trčala sam, vjerujući rijeci kad bi slegnuvši talasima zamijenila naše obraze, kroz dan pomdrači, ne sluteći koliko daljine stane u jedan ožiljak. Sad znam, čim se oblak prelomi, nahlupi plave te ispuni prazninu. Nebo je te glasine u svemu što smo izgubili. Gdje god da pogledam, tvoja sjena još nestaje za horizontom. I ja još trčim prema tebi, širom otvorenih ruku. Trčim unazad, uvijek, mama.
Thank you, Nóra, and thank you, Selma, for participating. I think we discussed some pretty interesting and important issues. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and thanks everyone for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Hvala svima, thank you.